Hi, I'm Jeremy Kirk with Intel 471, and welcome to another edition of Studio 471, which is a regular video interview series. We talk a lot about ransomware on this program, and today is no different. A UK think tank has done an interesting study into the harms of ransomware that go just beyond the financial impacts. It had lasting physical, psychological, and mental impacts on its victims, and it can actually ruin lives. The study comes from the Royal United Services Institute. With me today to talk about the study is Jamie MacColl, who's a research fellow in cyber threats and cybersecurity there. Thank you very much for joining me, Jamie.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
So this is the point where I usually ask, what do you do and how did you get into this? And I'm just going to preface this with your involvement in the band called Bombay Bicycle Club for almost 2 decades. This is a well-known band. You put out an album last year. Tell me about how you've gone from, actually, you're still in the band. This is still a very active project. How you went from
Yeah.
that into getting an interest into cybersecurity and ransomware.
So, yeah, I've been in the band since I was about 16 and I'm in my mid 30s now. And about 10 years ago, we went on a hiatus because we'd been doing it for a long time and needed sort of change of pace and a break from each other as well. And I went to university, ended up sort of doing strategic studies at King's College London in London. And as I was doing my degree, I started working at a cyber threat intelligence firm part-time, and then spent several years there, and then moved into policy research about 4 years ago. but kind of with still having a focus on sort of cyber threats predominantly, but with the policy implications of them. And then the band started up again 3 or 4 years ago. So I've been combining the two things, which is quite difficult because they're not really complementary in terms of the
I
subject matter.
I imagine so. I thought you were going to tell me a story about how your demo recordings were hacked, and that led you down this path to figure out the attackers.
There there was an interesting story a couple of years ago, actually, where someone was trying to extort. It was either a record label or some artists, I think, where they'd stolen some kind of recordings that hadn't been released yet. I think someone tried to do that to Radiohead at one point as well. But no, it hasn't happened to us.
Yes, yes. I think Radiohead ended up just releasing the whole thing for
Yeah,
free as a giveaway to fans, which was incredible.
yeah.
Um, but well, let's talk about ransomware, though. Your institute that you've worked for has put out a number of really incredible studies that is also kind of debunked some myths around ransomware, particularly around like cyber insurance, which I found really interesting. I want to get your take on just where are we at in the state of play of ransomware? We've had a lot of law enforcement busts. We've had a lot of ever increasing ransomware attacks, and we're kind of in this like real sort of standoff right now, where countries fear their critical infrastructure is going to be attacked. What's your kind
Yeah.
of assessment of where we stand now?
I mean, it's very hard to know given the kind of lack of transparency from victims and the lack of mandatory reporting in particular in most jurisdictions. So we just don't have the evidence to make, I think, good assessments at a national level. So it is a bit like sticking your finger up in the air and just guessing. But if I'm being optimistic or trying to be positive, I do think the situation has improved over the last several years. And I think generally, and this is kind of just anecdotally from like talking to people in incident response and insurance and law, I do think the severity of incidents seems to be going down. I actually think the shift to more data theft rather than encryption is actually quite beneficial in terms of the harm created by ransomware. And we can talk about that in the context of the paper maybe later. I think generally it seems like fewer victims are paying, even if the kind of the size of ransoms are still gone up.
Yep.
I think, really, really massive improvements in things like backup procedures and processes within organizations, which is part of the reason why we've seen the shift to data theft and extortion. And then on the law enforcement side, I mean, it's hard to know how much they've kind of truly disrupted or changed the ecosystem, but I think some of the sustained disruption operations we've seen, like it's easy to be um, kind of down on them, but I think
Yep.
it's a good trend.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, the paper is called "The Scourge of Ransomware: Victim Insights on Harms to Individuals, Organizations, and Society." Tell me about the background of the study, and then what did you do for it?
Yeah, so initially, so let me go back. So we've done several projects for the UK National Cybersecurity Centre over the last few years. The first couple were on cyber insurance, the ones you mentioned at the start, and it was kind of we were there's a lot of focus on ransomware in kind of policy circles now, and people want to understand the nature of it more. And I think what initially we thought about doing was trying to calculate the financial cost of ransomware to the UK as a whole. Quickly realized that no one has the data to be able to do that. So we started thinking about the kind of harms of ransomware in a broader sense. Because I think at a sort of policy making or like national communications level, being able to communicate all the different ways it hurts businesses, people, and the country as a whole is quite important in motivating action and kind of generating political will. Um, I think the other thing is we wanted to try and generate lessons from the experiences of victims so that future victims could learn how to be more resilient, um, not just prevent them from incidents from happening in the first place, but I think a lot of the focus in the second paper from the project that is coming out next month is on how do we how do you do things like your communications, how do you do crisis management so that you're kind of lessening the impact of an incident.
I was going to ask you about when the second part was going to come out. So that's next month, and that's kind of
Yes.
focuses on some of the solutions then to some of the, I guess, issues outlined in this one.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. And so you went out and you spoke to ransomware victims to kind of get these sort of firsthand accounts. How did you go about doing that? And what would you say is the reticence then, as that has always been around? I guess talking about ransomware.
Yeah. I mean, one of the inspirations for the project was actually the podcast series that you did a couple of years ago, because
Thank you
that
very much. Thank you.
the ransomware files, because that was a bit of a proof of concept for me, and that people would actually be prepared to talk about it publicly. Um, I mean, all the victims we spoke to, and even the word victims is so loaded because a lot
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the people we speak to don't consider themselves to be victims. Um, but we anonymized all of them in the final report, and that was a really important. Like the project wouldn't have happened, I think, if we
Yeah.
couldn't do because a lot of the companies that we interviewed, some of which are quite large multinational companies, a lot of them aren't in the public record that they've even had ransomware incidents. Um, and I think the reticence comes from, I mean, there's the perceived reputational harm, there's the fear of losing clients and customers, there's the kind of the shame factor,
Yep.
which I think the kind of tone of reporting hasn't always helped, and the kind of infosec kind of community culture about like reacting to reporting, which I think a lot of the time is about there is a bit of a kind of shaming narrative. A lot of the time, it's like, this company wasn't doing the basics, which is true in a lot of cases, but at the same
Yeah.
time, they are victims of a crime. And then I think there is the kind of general corporate culture, which I think often elevates kind of legal and regulatory concerns over transparency.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, those would be the things I think.
tell me about the reputational hit, because I find this really interesting, because your study found that um, it says, although customers and the public can be more forgiving than some victims believe.
Mm.
So, oftentimes when these incidents are reported, the business folks are kind of like, and their stock went down $5, and there are future concerns at quarterly earnings about customer churn for like big breaches, especially in kind of industries where I guess customers can sort of switch kind of easily. But tell me about, you found that, do people not necessarily hold it against companies and organizations because maybe this has happened so much, or
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to say. There are studies now that have shown that the kind of drop in share price following a cybersecurity incident tends to be temporary, and most of the time they recover fairly quickly. I think the reputational harm is quite sector dependent and nature of the business dependent. So I think certainly in the public sector, or in some critical national infrastructure providers, I think the public is quite forgiving of that. Partly because a lot of the time with those types of organizations, they don't have choice.
yes.
You can't swap your local council or your local hospital for an alternative, at least not in the UK. Um, and I think people do just accept that this is the reality of kind of modern economy, and like everyone is kind of a victim of fraud and
Yeah.
cybercrime now. And it's just, I think we've probably become desensitized to it. We've become desensitized to our data being freely available to a lot of criminals and private companies that want to exploit it as well. Um, I think where I think where companies do have an issue in terms of their reputation is maybe ones that are very operationally focused, who, and I'm talking about their clients as in other businesses rather than individual consumers. So if
Yeah.
they have just-in-time operations, I think, and their clients have a choice of switching elsewhere, I think that those are the kind of instances where following a ransomware attack, they may lose clients. Um,
So supply chain kind of concerns.
exactly. So
Yeah.
supply chain disruption. And then I think the other one is if it's a type of business that is sitting on very commercially sensitive data, that the loss of that data can obviously break down trust between a supplier and their customer.
Yes.
But
And
I
speaking
think
of,
one of the point about the reputational harm was also about there's a lot of people paying ransoms because of their data being stolen, being extorted for that data, and believing that if they don't pay, their reputation is going to suffer a big hit. And I think part of what we're trying to say is, I think in a lot of cases, you really don't need to be paying ransoms in those instances. And also, in the UK, data protection regulator and in other countries as well has been very clear that paying a ransom when data to suppress data does not negate your regulatory requirements and
exactly.
doesn't negate all the kind of data discovery exercises that you need to go through, the notification processes. So there's not a compelling reason to pay a ransom in a lot of those cases.
Yes. Yes. And speaking of like leaked data, there was also another interesting point in this. You found that downstream harm to individuals from ransomware is more severe when the attacks just encrypt IT infrastructure rather than steal and leak data. It says that there's no evidence to this research that the ransomware ecosystem is monetizing that leaked data,
Yeah.
at least at this point. It's a really interesting point, and it also goes to your point about not paying.
Yeah, I think that this was based on that was a lot of open source reporting, a lot of speaking to people in threat intelligence and incident response that specialize in ransomware, and basically no one has seen personal financial data that's come from ransomware specifically being exploited for fraud. And that doesn't mean it won't in the future. And I think that it also doesn't mean that, say, initial access brokers aren't going through some of that data to look for stolen credentials that could be used in further operations. It's just like it's not being monetized for large scale fraud at this point.
Yes.
And I think there's a few reasons for that. The first is that just doing ransomware is really profitable. So if you're a ransomware affiliate, it's much more profitable to just carry on doing ransomware than trying to clean and organize and kind of store very large customer data sets so that they can be easily exploited. There's that. And then there's just the difficulty of doing it, I think, with very large data sets.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, if there are people watching this that can have examples of where it is being exploited for fraud, then would love to hear about them.
Yeah.
Love's the wrong word, but
It's always been difficult to like link individual cases of fraud against people to a specific event, and it's especially complicated by the fact that there's just so much stolen data out there to say that, oh, it was this specific bit from this event that caused this. Very difficult to do correlations like that.
yeah. I mean, I think I hate to use like a buzzword like AI, but I think it may be the case that like advances in technology on the attacker side like enable them to monetize that data in a more efficient way in the future. I'm just not sure we're at that point yet.
Yeah, yeah, we've seen a bit of interest in using AI to sort of go through large data sets. You know, if you're able to say, okay, pull out all the Barclays account numbers from, you know, what's 50 terabytes of data, like that's really useful if AI can pull that off in like 10 seconds, right? But uh, we'll see if it gets to that point. Hopefully, it won't get to that point.
Yeah,
Um,
I, I think it doesn't mean that there's no risk from that data. And actually some of the kind of most egregious examples we got about exploiting stolen data from ransomware was not financially motivated. It was essentially things like safeguarding data from schools or law firms that were stolen. And then, you know, it could be things like other pupils at the school accessing that data and then finding out, you know, potentially really embarrassing or kind of life-changing kind of data about their fellow pupils. One example we had was of you know, a victim of domestic violence, their ex-partner essentially accessing safeguarding data and then trying to exploit it. So I think we need
my.
to kind of broaden our understanding of what kind of harm can come from stolen data and not just focus on the financial aspects.
And so that instance that you just referred to came through your interviews, and was
Yeah,
that kind of a surprise then too, to I guess.
I think so. I think the part that surprised for me was that there were people out there that knew how to kind of find and access the data.
Yeah.
Because I think I tend to think of it as still quite a niche topic, but maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what I liked about the study too is that it took it beyond into sort of second and third order costs. So you've got the organization that are affected, people indirectly affected, and then you've got the broader effects of ransomware on society. Tell me about some of those conclusions that you were able to come to.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the study, the further away we got from the initial kind of victim that we were interviewing, it's obviously harder to try and quantify the kind of downstream harms. But I think the way we broke it down was into harms to national security, the economy, and society. Um, and I think the national security one is kind of obvious. Like, you know, it's the disruption of critical national infrastructure. It's threats to public safety. I think, you know, we've particularly seen that with some of the healthcare incidents in the last kind of 9 to 12 months. both in the US but also in the UK in the last couple of days. We've had major disruption of several London hospitals.
Yes.
There's the kind of strategic advantage to adversaries. So although um, ransomware for the most part in Russia, is carried out by individuals that either have no connection to the Russian state or it's quite a loose connection. But nevertheless, I think particularly at this point in the last 2 years of essentially being in a kind of proxy war with Russia in effect over Ukraine, I think Russia benefits enormously from the disruption to Western critical national infrastructure. And then in the cases of countries like North Korea, you actually have parts of the intelligence services that are using ransomware to generate money for their
Yes.
nuclear weapons program and other parts of the North Korean state. On the societal front, you have, as I said, the impact on healthcare. You have the impact on national education. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of schools in the UK alone in the last couple of years that have been affected by ransomware. And a number of the victims we interviewed were schools and universities. And that, it's not only disrupts education, it's also, psychologically distressing for children and parents to know that there may be sensitive data that's been leaked on the dark web. I think the other thing is that it's just a massive opportunity cost, not just for businesses that they're having to spend money to recover from these incidents, but also for the public sector in particular. We interviewed local governments, like local councils in the UK, where they essentially had to spend all their reserves to recover from an incident. And that's money that could be going on local services, social services, a lot of the kind of crucial things that local governments provide that we kind of take for granted, like,
Sure.
collecting the bins and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Fixing the local swimming pool or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
And in the UK, we've had 15 years of quite hard cuts to local government services and austerity. So I think the thing with one of the important things we tried to do with the paper was to try and contextualize cybersecurity within broader kind of societal and political contexts, because when you have these incidents, they don't take place in a vacuum. It's money that's being taken from somewhere else to do something positive and to be spent on recovering from like a kind of catastrophic incident that's been caused by, cyber criminals harbored essentially by a kind of hostile state.
Yes. Yes. You spoke with some people who they had medical issues, they had heart attacks. There was some people who contemplated suicide, other mental repercussions. Were these did this take you by surprise somewhat? I know that when I approached the ransomware files, I did kind of naively think this is computer crime in a way, but it wasn't. It was way deeper than I ever thought it was. Tell me about some of the stories you heard.
Yeah, I think I mean, for the people working at an organization affected by ransomware, particularly in kind of IT functions, I mean, they're going to be spending months responding and recovering from the incident, and potentially working kind of 20-hour days for several weeks, often quite isolated from other parts of the company in the case of IT teams, and often treated like they are responsible for the incident in a lot of ways as well. So there's not only the shame factor in terms of how they're perceived by, reporters or outside of the organization, but there's also a shame factor, I think, just from other people within the organization. So that all takes quite a substantive physical toll, the kind of long hours, the, eating terrible food for several weeks. And, people listening to this that work in incident response will be familiar with all of this. But then there is, it's psychologically distressing as well. There's burnout. I mean, it is distressing to be extorted by criminals who are threatening you. Maybe they're
Yeah.
calling you. They're calling you on your office phone. They might be calling you on your home phone. They
They're
might be.
WhatsApping you, in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I heard an anecdote recently about someone sending flowers to someone's wife, with a sort of threatening note. So and that kind of aggression is scary.
That actually brings it to the doorstep because when you look at it, it's a sort of abstract vacuum of, cross borders. But when these people are using tactics like that, I mean, that's scary. That would bother anyone.
Yeah. And I think particularly, I mean, it's hard to know how much a group like Wizard Spider is doing. I don't mean Wizard Spider. I mean, what's the group of teenagers?
Scattered spider.
Spider, yeah.
Yeah,
I
or
mean,
the
with
calm. We refer to them as the
yeah,
calm because
okay,
that's where they come out of. But yeah,
sure. So the Common or Scatter Spider is obviously particularly aggressive with those kind of tactics. But I would kind of questionable the extent to which they're adjacent to the ransomware ecosystem as a whole.
yeah, right. Dipping a toe in it. I guess it'll probably play out more this year as law enforcement digs into their business a lot deeper. Um, let's talk about some solutions then. So, there's recommendations at the end of this paper, and you've got another paper coming out too. Tell me a little bit about what are some policy options do we have to, I guess, counter some of these ills?
Hmm. I mean, I think the biggest thing for me is mandatory reporting, to be honest. Um,
And that's on the cards in the UK now, and
yeah,
Australia.
so
And, mm.
yeah, there was a story in the record last week or the week before about the government is going to have a consultation on several policy proposals, including mandatory reporting, and then some others related to ransom payments. I have historically been skeptical of it just because of the already quite significant burden on a lot of organizations in terms of their existing reporting requirements. But actually, I think it is essential. Like, you can't make good policy without having good evidence, and you can't motivate people to care about it, particularly kind of ministers within government to care about it without knowing the kind of scale of the problem and the nature of the problem. So I think that's the most important one. And then I think the other thing we have coming out in the next paper is just a lot of focus, both for organizations, but also for guidance from law enforcement and government on trying to ensure that the kind of psychological aspect of crisis management and responding to incidents is more kind of established than it currently is.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that law enforcement increasingly has been reaching out and saying, "Hey, you can come to us, and we might be able to help you." We saw with the Hive ransomware group, we also saw this with the Lockbit disruption. They were pulling decryption keys out of those groups' systems. So they're still actively helping organizations that are victims of this. And I think I've heard it again and again and again, like trying to overcome this barrier of like, oh, we don't want to tell anybody about this to like, well, actually, they might save you too, so
Well, yeah, I mean, so in the second paper, there's a chapter on the kind of views of victims on UK law enforcement and the NTSC, and a lot of them, to be frank, are quite negative. Because
oh
and
no.
that a lot of that reticence about reporting is not just the kind of fear of the reputational harm; it's also the the dominant experience for the last several years, and I'd say up until quite recently, is there is very little value from reporting to law enforcement outside of kind of altruism, outside of giving them data that might help kind of combat the challenge.
Yes.
Because until some of these recent operations, there's not been much that law enforcement can do to help victims. This is the kind of response to ransomware is largely a privatized phenomenon. When you're going to get help, you're going to an incident response company, you're going to your insurer, you're going to a law firm. You're not getting a team of people from, law enforcement or the UK or Australian kind of national cybersecurity centers.
Yeah, yeah. Even though that data that they get, IOCs, TTPs, that's all really valuable for the advisories that NCSC and CISA and ACSC down here in Australia put out. What do you think it takes to, I guess, sort of get organizations thinking like, yes, this is we should reach out to law enforcement. We should reach out to these national cybersecurity coordinators.
I think that, well, obviously forcing them to do it is one way.
That
I
is one
think,
way.
yeah, if it's voluntary, I think it's creating a positive feedback loop. So it can't be a black hole where you give them data and that's it. And that's, I mean, a black hole is a phrase that we actually heard quite a lot from victims, in that we send data to law enforcement and then we never hear from them again.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so I think things like, so obviously from a, like, if law enforcement has access to decryption keys or bits of tactical or kind of operational intelligence on a specific threat actor, great. That's going to be quite rare still. I think what's one thing we talk about is even just notifying victims if they've sent you data, if that data has played a role in an investigation or a takedown in a positive way, just tell the people that have reported to you. It will make them feel better. It will make them feel like there's been some value to what they've done. And the next time they have an incident, they'll think, okay, it is worth reporting because we're helping kind of fight the problem.
And that's purely a human problem or a human thing, right? That's not a doesn't it's not a technical thing at all. It's just like good relations. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also
Building rapport.
it's broader things like, I would expect if you are a victim of a crime, a police officer would come and visit you. Just to, even just to say, to ask you if you're okay, even if there's no chance of solving the crime, which in ransomware there's normally not. And I think it's small things like that that would help.
Awesome. Well, so the second paper is going to come out next month, you said?
Yes, just at the beginning of July, so right around the general election in the UK, so which means probably no one will read it.
Maybe push it out a couple months. We'll see. We'll see. I'll definitely be looking for it. And I know people in this, our niche sphere will be looking for it too. And we should also mention Bombay Bicycle Club's My Big Day album came out last year. Is an excellent album. I was jamming to it in the car today. So
Also
thank you
coming
very
to Australia in a few months, so
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Jamie.
great. Thank you.